Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I am the host of Reformed GGA, and today I'm going to be doing a video on some of the basic differences between ARs and AKs and kind of just what goes into owning them and some considerations that a prospective buyer might be interested in. The reason why I'm making this video is that I had a conversation earlier today, a very brief conversation earlier today, with one of the children in my church, and I really shouldn't say children. She's now getting into the stage where she's, preparing to become a young adult, so not quite child anymore, not quite an adult either. The teenage years just suck, just saying. It's that awkward in-between stage where everything is weird and crazy, but that being aside, we don't need to go down memory lane right there. But that being aside, this young person is, like I said, at a stage in her life where she is preparing to become an adult, and because of that, there's things on her mind that are relevant to that. Who are you going to marry? What job do you want to have? Do you have enough money to put down on a house? Do you have enough money to put down on a car? All those kinds of things that go into, basic adulting are things that she's starting to consider. And along with that whole basic adulting thing is the fact that as an adult, you're now the one who has to foot the bill on everything. And so if there's something that you want to do for fun, recreationally, or something that you feel is important to the way that you live and the way you want to live, well, whether it's a necessity or whether it's just for fun, whatever the case happens to be, whatever you do as an adult is up to you. You're the one who has to foot the bill. And in her particular case, she's part of a family that actually does quite a bit of shooting. I go shooting with them from time to time. Maybe not a ton, but they do go shooting on a fairly regular basis, mostly hunting. And like I said, for the practice runs, I don't actually go out hunting with them because I don't hunt. But for the practice sessions and whatnot, oftentimes I will tag along, and we'll go out and we'll shoot various guns and just have all kinds of fun doing it. And as long as people are safe and sane about it, I'm all good with the American shooting as recreation and all that kind of things. But she's basically decided that that is something that she would like to continue as an adult. She would continue to like to shoot recreationally. She would like to continue to that more or less tradition that has developed in her family of shooting for fun and also shooting for hunting, putting it to good use, putting meat on the table, that kind of thing. That's something that she would like to do. And so earlier today, she talked to me very briefly about some of the guns that I own. She's kind of, thinking in the future, what do I want to do? And we talked a little bit about ARs and AKs. And so that's why we're talking about this right now. What are the basic differences between them? What are the similarities? How do they stack up compared to traditional hunting rifles, which is mostly what she uses and what she has access to, unless I happen to be around, and then I bring whatever weird wacko thing I happen to be working on at the time, and that's always fun. At least I think it's fun. But basically just what goes into it and those kinds of things. The first thing that we're going to talk about is kind of the traditional calibers for these guns. This gun right here that I'm holding is an AR. This one has been heavily modified because I don't shoot a traditional caliber out of this one. This one has been modified to take AK magazines, even though it's an AR. So it has a Rock and Lock mag on it, which is not typical for ARs, but this is actually an AR. The gas system that has is an AR gas system. The bolt it has is an AR bolt. It's just been modified to shoot a different caliber. Now these guns are typically chambered in, this one isn't, but these ones are typically chambered in this cartridge right here. This is 5.56, or in the American commercial version of it, it's called 223. The calibers are virtually identical, at least as far as the case dimensions are concerned. The only real differences between those two, 5.56 and 223, they both basically look like this. The only real difference between them is that 5.56 rounds will have bullets that project out of the casing a little bit more, so they'll sit a little bit higher, as this one was. This is basically a 5.56 profile. And then the guns that they shoot out of for 5.56 have a little bit deeper throat in the chamber area. But other than that, 5.56 guns and 223 guns are extremely similar. They differ in basically the throat area of the chamber. And because of that, you really shouldn't mix ammo types, especially going from one that's designed for shorter ammunition and putting long ammunition in it. That's not good. So the way that it works is, if you have a 5.56 gun, you can put 2.23 ammo in it, but you shouldn't do the reverse. If you have a 2.23 gun, you should not put 5.56 ammo in it. Now, a lot of times it's not that big of a deal, but still generally not a good practice. All right, so that is AR and the ammo that an AR will shoot. And for comparison, let's take a look at the AK. All right, so this is more or less a fairly typical AK, not necessarily in terms of the furniture and the other doodads that I have on it, but in terms of basic performance for an American-made AK, this is going to be relatively typical. And these guns will typically shoot this round here, 7.62 by 39. It is kind of a squatty round by comparison, and definitely has a bigger bullet. And the advantage of AKs relative to ammunition is that their ammunition is relatively inexpensive. So here we have a typical AR round, 5.56 2.23, and typical AK round here at my right, 7.62 by 39. And in terms of expense, the 5.56 is definitely the more expensive. Usually at least 7 cents a round more expensive. It depends on the time you're looking at it and exactly where you're comparing prices and all that, but usually at least 7 cents a round more expensive. And at times like now, depending on where you're looking and whatnot, sometimes the difference will be even more. Sometimes it will be like 10 to 15 cents a round difference, sometimes even more than that depending on the kinds of ammo that you're comparing. For example, if you're comparing the brass case 5.56 ammo, which is fairly typical for 5.56 compared to the steel case of 7.62 by 39, which is much more typical for 7.62 by 39, then you can get some really big differences. Brass case 5.56 will very commonly nowadays sell for 60 cents a round, 80 cents a round, somewhere in that price margin. Whether or not it should cost that is certainly debatable, but it's not uncommon for it to be sold for that price. Whereas 7.62 by 39 right now is being sold for around 30 cents a round. That's the steel case version, of course, but you know, that's like half the cost. That adds up over time. And that's the main reason why I do a lot of 7.62 by 39 shooting, is because if you do enough shooting, that difference in cost starts to add up pretty quickly. If you're only going to shoot 5 or 10 rounds in a year or whatever, okay, it's not a big deal. But if you're going to shoot hundreds and maybe thousands of rounds in a year, that adds up really quickly. And so that is the main reason why I like 7.62 by 39, is just because it's a relatively inexpensive round. Now, as to the functionality of the guns themselves, a lot of people in America, in terms of how the guns function, really prefer ARs, and that's totally understandable why. For one thing, ARs typically are a lighter gun, so if you're going to be carrying it around for a long time, having something that's a little bit lighter, easier to manage that way is going to be better. Also, in the caliber, the typical caliber for them, 5.56, they're also relatively soft recoiling. The recoil system that they have on them is actually internal to the bolt carrier. They actually have an internal piston, and so you don't have anything that's off of the center line. And when the gun recoils, it recoils very straight, very direct. It has a good buffering system in the buffer tube on the back here. In 5.56 and other calibers can be a little bit different in terms of recoil impulse, but in 5.56, the caliber that ARs are originally designed for, they're pretty soft shooting, especially if you get a full-length one. If you get a full-length rifle with a 20-inch barrel, those things are extremely soft shooting, and absolutely fantastic in that regard. Little shorties like this one, they're not so great in terms of recoil. They tend to be a little bit more jarring, especially if you get them in different calibers. Like I said, this one's in 7.62 by 39, so this one's a little bit more on the recoil side. It's not quite as pleasant that way. But they are typically lighter, and provided you do traditional ammunition in them, typically a little bit softer recoiling as well. And then the ergonomics on them, a lot of people like, especially if you're a right-hander. The safety is going to be in a fairly good spot for you to reach with your thumb. That's what I'm flipping right there. On ones with traditional 5.56 ammunition, the magazine stop will be right where my the magazine release will be right where my index finger is. This one has it down low because it's been modified to take AK mags, but usually it's right on the side where my index finger is. And then on the other side there'll be a bolt release. This one doesn't have it because, again, it takes AK mags, and AKs don't have a last round bolt hold open feature, but the bolt release would be on the other side, and it's fairly ergonomic, easy to work with. Lots of people just like how ARs feel. They like how they manipulate. Like I said, lighter, fairly easy to point, so on and so forth. And in terms of accuracy, there's a little bit of debate about just how accurate one is or the other, but usually with decent ammunition and a decently well set up AR, a free float barrel and those kinds of things, that is a barrel whose shroud does not actually touch the barrel, they're usually going to be a little bit more accurate. The standard going rate right now is, in terms of commercial ARs, a lot of them will average out at least around 1.2 MOA or so. And MOA, for those of you who don't know, is minute of angle, and it corresponds roughly to 1 inch at 100 yards. So if you say that you have a 1 MOA rifle, what you're saying is that if I shoot a group, say 5 rounds or so, at 100 yards, I'm saying that I'll be able to put those 5 rounds within 1 inch of each other. It'll be a 1 inch size group down range. So a lot of ARs with typical AR ammunition, sometimes you have to hunt around a little bit to find the exact kind of ammunition that the gun likes, but a lot of ARs will wind up shooting around 1.2 MOA fairly easily. There are things that you can do to them to make them a little bit more accurate, but 1.2 MOA is considered fairly typical. Some of them are better, some of them are worse. A lot of it depends on whether or not you have a free flow handguard or not, and also just the build quality of the barrel, things like that, etc., etc. I've seen ARs, I've actually owned an AR that, depending on the ammunition that I had in it, wouldn't shoot better than a 3.5 MOA, at least with some kinds of ammunition. That was my Delton, that with M855, that's a type of 5.56 ammo, it would not shoot better than 3.5 MOA. I could even put the best crosshair scope I wanted to on there and get the most stable shooting position I possibly could, wait for a nice windless day, all that kind of stuff, and I could not get that thing to shoot better than 3.5 MOA. Now, it didn't have a free float barrel. 855 ammo, that's what it's called, M855, is not always the best in terms of groups. There are some guns that like it, some guns that don't. That one evidently didn't. So that one didn't shoot particularly well, but it's still within standard for ARs. ARs is basically 4 MOA and less is considered acceptable for a lot of ARs, and that is the military standard that is used on military versions. Like I said, the typical civilian ones with the right ammo will turn out to be, on average, around 1.2 MOA. The military standard, though, is just 4 MOA. As long as you can get a 4-inch group at 100 yards, it's considered accurate enough for the military, which is weird that the civilian versions are actually a lot of times more accurate than the military versions are. Interesting. All right, so that is the ARs, and in terms of expense, I mean, you can doodad them up to make them incredibly expensive, but you can usually get into a decent one with a scope and maybe a few other amenities on it for under $1,000 fairly easy if you want something that's brand new. If you want something that's good and used, you're probably going to be looking in the $600 to $700 range, but certainly less than $1,000. But do bear in mind that the ammo is going to be more expensive. In terms of application, it is not an overly powerful round, and I'm talking to someone who is used to dealing with hunting rounds here. Keep that in mind. This is someone who has, shot 30-06 or 7mm 08s and those kinds of things used in hunting applications, and 223/5.56 is not going to perform like those rounds. Those are true hunting calibers that are meant for true hunting applications. 223/5.56 ammo, it's really small. This is basically a 22 caliber bullet. It just has more powder behind it than a typical 22 does. it's not really going to deliver the same kind of punch as a traditional rifle round will. No, neither of these actually will. They're called intermediate caliber rifles for a reason. They're not as powerful as a true hunting rifle is. And so what you can do with it and expect to be able to do with it kind of needs to be moderated in that sense. Depending on where you live, you will actually be prohibited from using ARs in 5.56 for certain hunting applications. For example, I think Colorado is one of the ones that limits its use. I think in Colorado and various other places, you're not allowed to use 223/5.56 to hunt big game. So deer, elk on up, not allowed to use it because it's considered to be underpowered for that application. Now, they're usually perfectly fine with it being used for varmints, rock chucks, squirrels, coyotes, things like that. It's usually considered perfectly adequate for that. But for the bigger game, there are a lot of places where you're just flat out not allowed to use it on big game, and even in places where you are allowed to use it, the people who do use it will tell you really, 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 really need to make sure that you are good at getting proper shot placement, because this is a very small bullet. It's basically just a 22. Has a lot bigger powder charge behind it than a regular 22, but it's basically a 22 bullet. And if you want it to do the job, you need to make sure that you have really good shot placement and you know what you're doing. It's not a very forgiving round in that sense. And you also need to be very careful about bullet selection. Some calibers, you can pick almost any kind of bullet that is out there, whether it be full metal jacket or soft points or ballistic tip, boat tail. Boat tail is more of a thing for accuracy than it is for performance, although it can have some performance boost, but mostly it's an accuracy thing. But you can pick just about any projectile that's on the shelf, and for most of your smaller game like mule deer and things like that, it will still get the job done. It might not be as ideal as other things, but say 30-06 for example, even in full metal jacket, it's not ideal, but you can still take down a deer with full metal jacket 30-06 just fine. Yes, shot placement is a good idea, but if you don't happen to get the best soft point round out there, you're still going to manage to do a pretty decent job. With 5.56 on the other hand though, if you go out hunting with just regular full metal jacket ammunition, especially depending on the type, this is the steel case stuff, and it has a bimetal jacket that does not fragment very easily and does not really perform very well in terms of soft tissue damage on game animals. You're going to be very underwhelmed. This particular kind of round would have a tendency to over-penetrate and not do a whole lot of damage on the way through, which would not make for a very successful kill depending on shot placement, which means that the animal is going to suffer, it's going to run off, probably lose it, and it's a very small hole, so it's not going to have a very good blood trail, etc., etc. That's one of the things you just need to consider about intermediate rifle calibers. They can be used to hunt big game, and I know people here in Idaho who use ARs in 5.56 to hunt deer on a very regular basis, but again, like I said, these are people who practice very regularly. They are very good at placing that shot exactly where they want to place it, and they're also very careful about their bullet selection. And if you do all those things, yes, you can use it as a successful deer hunting gun. But you need to be careful about making sure you get all those combinations right. You practice to make sure you can place the shot where you want, make sure you have the right kind of bullet tip, or right kind of projectile. Well, that would be the bullet, cartridge as a whole, but the right kind of projectile especially, it takes a little bit of work that way. Another thing that you have to consider with ARs is that they do have a fair amount, not as much as AKs, but they do have a fair amount of, pokey-outy bits on them. And if you're going to be carrying them around in the field for a while, all the little pokey-outy bits can kind of wear on you a little bit. And granted, while ARs are typically lighter than AKs, they're not as light as a typical hunting gun. And so, like I said, if you're going to be out in the field with one of these for a prolonged period of time, kind of have weird shapes, weird pokey-outy bits, and they're still not going to be as light as a traditional hunting gun, and while they can be fairly accurate, 1.2 MOA is not bad at all. Of course, like I said, with some ammunitions they get a lot worse, like 4 MOA. But still, accurate enough for most intended purposes. They're still not going to compete with a traditional hunting rifle in terms of power. They're not going to compete with a traditional hunting rifle in terms of accuracy. They're not going to compete with a traditional hunting rifle in terms of weight and comfort while carrying it, those kinds of things. There are some disadvantages to having these guns, especially in a hunting type application. Now, the nice thing about it is that you can use it in other applications. There's, of course, home defense. There's just general recreational shooting, because going out and firing a whole 30-round magazine into the dirt is fun. And I'm totally okay with people doing that. And if that's what you want to get a gun for, by all means, have at it. Just be safe about it, be sane about it, be responsible. But yeah, that's totally a legitimate reason to own a gun. If you want to go out and just have fun, go out and have fun. Like I said, be safe, be sane about it, be responsible about it. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with owning a gun just so you can go out now and have fun with it. But also be realistic about the fact that these guns are going to be usually a little bit heavier than a corresponding hunting rifle. A lot of times not as powerful because it's only an intermediate cartridge. There's also a lot of initial expense. Like I said, a decent used one with scope and everything else attached to it and all those kinds of things, you're probably looking at least $700. For a brand new one with a scope and everything else attached to it, probably pretty close to $1,000 once you get everything attached to it. All right, so that is ARs. So main advantages with an AR is that it tends to be more accurate. It tends to be more ergonomic, and compared to AKs, they're typically less expensive to start off with. Now, the ammo is more expensive, and so that gets offset at a certain point. But at least to get into the gun, it's usually a little cheaper to start with. So more ergonomic, a little bit more accurate, cheaper to start off with. All those kinds of things are good things, but be aware of the limitations. .223 is not a very powerful round, like most intermediate cartridges in general, not super powerful. You need to be really careful if you want to use it as a hunting gun, and just don't expect it to do too much. You can push it to the point where you use it as a deer gun, and you could do very well there, but you need to make sure that you're accurate with it, and you need to make sure that you have the right kind of projectile for that application. Moving on to AKs. AKs are easily my personal favorites, and that is just because the ammo that they shoot is so much cheaper. This stuff right here, 30 cents a round, and out of this particular gun, it's actually very accurate. This is an American-made AK, and I need to specify that. But this does have a chrome line barrel, and by the way, for those of you who don't know, chrome line barrels last significantly longer, but they tend to hurt accuracy. But given that this is an American-made AK, the accuracy is still pretty good. This particular gun shoots about 1.4 MOA. So not as good as a lot of ARs. Like I said, a lot of ARs are going to average out around 1.2 MOA. Some, actually quite a few, being better, and depending on the ammo at least, some being considerably worse. An American-made AK like this one can actually be quite accurate. Like I said, this one, I can get 1.4 MOA out of it as long as I do my job as the shooter. Now, that's not typical of all AKs, though. A lot of the foreign-produced, a lot of the import AKs, usually don't have very great accuracy. They usually average around 4 MOA. So ARs, they average at 1.2 MOA. AKs oftentimes will average around 4 MOA. Like I said, that's not true of all of them. This particular one is really good. It's 1.4. But in general, AKs are going to be less accurate. Like I said, about 4 MOA, some of them a little bit worse, some of them a little bit better, but 4 is pretty typical. This one is not normal in that regard. It's an American-made AK, so it has kind of American-made precision. In America, especially for the commercial market, we tend to emphasize accuracy over most other things, and so it tends to be a very accurate gun by comparison. So cheap ammunition, and this particular one is fairly accurate. What are some of the other advantages? Well, it's not going to be ergonomics because the controls on AKs are kind of in weird places. The magazine release is down here, unlike on ARs where it's next to the index finger. This one I've modified so that the index finger can operate the safety here. That's what this lever is. However, a lot of AKs do not come stock with this kind of a selector level. Instead, you'll actually have to come up and actually thumb the safety, so it's a little bit awkward. And then the charging handle is not back here with you, it's off to the side and it's on the right hand, and so if you're a right-handed person, right-handed charging handle right there is usually a little bit awkward. If you're right-handed, you usually want the charging handle on the left side because your left hand is not going to be the main control hand. But AKs, they don't do that. They put the charging handle, the safety, all that stuff on the same side, and it's not ergonomically the most friendly gun out there. Now, is this kind of stuff going to mess with you too much if you're just going out to plink? You know, not really a big deal. And frankly, even in military applications, having all those things like that don't really actually affect all that much. If you're a competitive shooter, it can definitely be a problem because in competitive shooting, you know, like microseconds count. But in military applications, law enforcement applications, general recreation, fun, those kinds of things, it really doesn't matter that much, but it is ergonomically inferior. So a lot of people don't like the controls on AKs, and that is a perfectly fair point. I mostly like them because they are cheap to shoot. And another thing about them is that the cartridge that they shoot, 7.62 x 39, is actually a relatively low pressure cartridge. Most of the rounds that are out there for AKs come in at a pressure of around 45,000 psi in terms of chamber pressure. In comparison, the 5.56 that the AR shoots, this is actually a pretty high pressure cartridge. A lot of the cartridges will start at about 55,000 psi, and there are a few that get as high as like 75,000. Those are not typical, and those are not necessarily ones that I would recommend, but mid 50s to low 60,000s in terms of PSI for these cartridges is pretty common. And the problem with having such a high pressure cartridge is that it tends to put more wear and tear on the gun, especially on the barrel. ARs you can keep running for a long time because it's relatively easy to change out barrels on them. On ARs you can pretty much replace everything. That's going back to ARs, that's one of the advantages. There are tons of people out there that make ARs right now, and you can get just about every piece and part, you know, from a wide variety of vendors online, and also a lot of shops will carry AR parts now. You can replace a lot of these things and be able to get a gun that was working basically just as good as it was before. It's relatively easy to do a barrel swap on these. It's very easy to change most of the components in the back. It's really easy to modify these and keep them running. And there are some people who have over 200,000 rounds on their ARs. Now, the components of the AR are not original at all. They've usually changed out the barrel several times, and a lot of the other components they've had to change out several times. But the main receiver, which is legally what is considered the gun, well, actually on ARs it's the lower part of the receiver, that hasn't changed. They've changed everything else about it a few times over, but what is legally considered the gun, the lower receiver part, that hasn't changed, and so legally speaking, it's the same gun with 200,000 rounds through it. But they do have to change out the parts fairly frequently. Depending on the ammo that you shoot, you could burn out a barrel in as little as 5,000 rounds. Now, that can change with ammo, and it also depends on how hard on the gun you're being. Are you doing a lot of mag dumps, or is it just one round here, one round there? A little 5-shot group here, wait a while, little 5-shot group over here. You're not really getting the gun too hot. It's not going to wear out as quickly. But having the barrel wear out within 5,000 rounds with ARs, especially if you like to do a lot of mag dumps and things like that, is not overly uncommon. Like I said, easy to fix. It's easy to find, or I should say, relatively easy to find. Just these past few months have been rather interesting. But usually it's relatively easy to find replacement barrels and whatnot for ARs. AKs, on the other hand, getting replacement parts for them can be a real bear. Very, very, very problematic. But the nice thing about them is that they tend to last longer. This particular one, because it has a chrome line barrel, is probably going to last minimally 20,000 rounds, and that's even if I put the worst, junkiest ammo through it I can and make a frequent habit of mag dumping it. If I don't do that, if I put better ammunition through it, especially not bimetal jacket bullets and those kinds of things, proper copper jacketed bullets, those kinds of things, put better ammunition through it. The copper jacketed bullets would be considered better ammunition. And as long as I'm not mag dumping it and things like that, it could probably last up to 40,000 rounds and be perfectly fine. So it does last longer. Like I said, the ergonomics are not so great. Most of the people don't like the controls on AKs all that well. But they do tend to last a good long time. The ammunition that they shoot is very cheap, but there is definitely a downside to that, and that is the AKs are not inexpensive guns. This particular one right here, as kitted out as you see it right now, is about a $1,500 gun. Some of them out there are, of course, going to be less. Some of them are going to be more. If you get one on the used market, you could probably get maybe into one for around $700-ish. But realistically, you should probably plan on spending at least $1,000 on it. And like I said, if you want to have a good optic and whatnot on there, it's probably going to be more. And it is worth pointing out that AK optics are a little bit strange. They have the side mounting system on them, and that adds expense. The mount itself is over $100. Some of them get pretty close to $200. And the optics themselves, if you want one that has a bullet drop compensator that's designed for this kind of ammunition, that's not as typical. They can be a little bit harder to get a hold of, and sometimes that also corresponds with greater expense. It's not uncommon at all to spend, at least, $400, $500 on a mount and optic combination. That's not uncommon at all. And like I said, $500 that you're putting into the optic is about as much as you could put together in a used hunting rig that would basically do the same task as far as the hunting side is concerned. That would be, just as good, if not better in some regards. Why people get into ARs and AKs generally isn't to save money. It's generally because they want to have a project gun, they want to have a gun that's fun to go out and plink with, and frankly, having things like 30-round magazines that you're not going to get in most hunting guns, that is fun, that is nice. Go ahead and check, make sure I'm clear here. That's fun, perfectly legitimate reason to own the gun, but understand there is going to be some expense in there. Like I said, you can make that up to a certain extent with ammo because the ammo is really cheap. So yeah, the gun costs a lot, but keeping it running afterwards is much less expensive. So pros and cons there. What are some other things that would be irrelevant? Yeah, I guess that pretty much covers the basics. One thing that does need to be noted about the 7.62 by 39 ammo that the AK uses. The AK is also a gun that shoots an intermediate cartridge. 7.62 by 39 is not as powerful as a full-size rifle cartridge is. It's not going to compare with 30-06. It's not going to compare with 7mm 08. It's just not what it's designed to do. It wasn't designed to be a hunting type gun. These kinds of guns were designed around military applications where they wanted to give people a bunch of rounds and it be relatively easy to carry. In a military context, you're not interested in putting an animal down humanely. Militaries are much more interested in battlefield casualties, basically getting somebody to stop shooting back at you. They're not necessarily interested in fatalities. They aren't hunters. They're not trying to kill everybody on the battlefield. They're just trying to neutralize the threat. And that's not the same goal. For a hunter, you want to put down the animal quickly and humanely. And so fairly powerful cartridge, fairly accurately placed, with good bullet design for that, etc., is the order of the day. In military applications, though, you're not necessarily trying to kill the enemy, you're just trying to stop them from shooting back at you. And so being able to lay down a whole lot of cover fire in certain situations is a good thing, and you don't necessarily want to spend a whole lot on that. You want something that's relatively easy to produce, so you can lay down a lot of cover fire to keep people from shooting back at you. So you don't necessarily want to choose the most expensive ammunition that's out there for that. You want something that's relatively cheap. And also, it doesn't need to be overly powerful. A round, a bullet does not have to be overly powerful to get people to put their heads down and stop shooting at you. A .22 will do that, and there have been militaries that have used .22s in certain applications, certain government agencies that have used .22s in certain applications, and even law enforcement agencies that have used regular old .22s. I mean, and I'm talking regular .22 little plinker rimfire stuff, regular .22s in military applications, because that's what they're interested in, is just getting the threat neutralized, at least getting them to put their head down. And like I said, they don't necessarily need ultra powerful ammunition for that. They do want to have a lot of it on hand, and they do want it to be effective enough to make people, go for cover when they start firing and things like that. And they do want it to be able to cause enough of a wound to take people out of the fight, but they're not overly interested in killing people. For a military objective, you don't actually have to kill anyone a lot of times. Wounding them is usually perfectly adequate to the task. Not that they're necessarily against killing people either, because we are talking about militaries, but their goals are different than a hunter. Their goal is to create a casualty. A hunter, though, is interested in creating a fatality. When it comes to 7.62 by 39, it fits with that military philosophy of creating casualties, not fatalities. So it is technically more powerful than the 5.56 that the AR shoots. It is more powerful, but it's not by a ton. It's usually, it'll depend on barrel length to a certain extent in the particular cartridge and cartridge manufacturer that you're talking about, specific bullet design, things like that. But usually, 1 to 300 foot-pounds of energy more than a typical 5.56. So a 5.56 out of a decently long barrel will get you around maybe 1,400 foot-pounds of energy. A corresponding 7.62 by 39 out of what would be commensurate in terms of having a full-length barrel and things like that, and a decent powder charge for that caliber, will get you somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,600 foot-pounds of energy. So only about, in that particular example, only about 200-ish foot-pounds of energy difference. So it's not a whole lot more powerful. And then now, it does have an advantage of being simply a wider bullet, and so even if it doesn't perform all that well in terms of maybe soft point expanding like it should and those kinds of things, it does in fact make a little bit bigger hole, and so it does typically do a little bit better on large game than the 5.56 does. Like I said, there are some states that will actually outlaw 5.56 for hunting applications. However, 7.62 by 39 is usually not outlawed in those same states, but it is still underpowered compared to a traditional hunting rifle. It is still an intermediate cartridge. It's not uber powerful, and because of that, you're still going to want to be very careful about shot placement. You're still going to want to be careful about making sure you have the right kind of bullet design for that application. And there are plenty of good 7.62 by 39 hunting rounds that are out there that are perfectly adequate to the task. Most hunters would say that the 7.62 by 39, at least the ones I've talked to, would say that 7.62 by 39 is a little bit better for hunting, medium-ish sized game like deer and things like that. And there are a few people that have even pushed it up to larger game like elk, but under fairly controlled circumstances, usually fairly close with very good shot placement, very special attention to bullet design, things like that. A little bit better for larger game, but at the same time you still need to be realistic about it. And another thing that is very important to know with this round is that it is very much so affected by distance and wind. It is not nearly as fast as the 5.56 bullet is. It travels a lot slower, and so its trajectory is a little bit like a rainbow, kind of lobs in there. And so the further out you try to push it, the more holding over you're going to have to do to get it on target. That's a little bit of a problem, and also it is fairly big and it's easy for the wind to grab a hold of, and it tends to be affected by wind quite a bit. Depending on the crosswind you're dealing with, and in Idaho we get some really interesting crosswinds sometimes, it can take you many inches and sometimes several feet off of target, depending on the distance you're talking about and just how much of a crosswind you're dealing with. That's not nothing. So it's not a very good long distance round. So in terms of hunting applications, what a lot of people would say is that 5.56 is basically a varmint round, but you can use it at pretty great distances because it's a fairly fast projectile, and so it's fairly flat shooting, and you don't have to do a whole lot of holdover kind of stuff with it. So more of a varmint round, but can be used at pretty great distances. 7.62 by 39 is a fairly big bullet by comparison. It's not very big by comparison to other bullets, but relative to 5.56, it's a fairly big bullet, and so it typically does a little bit better with the larger game animals, especially if you have good bullet design, but it's not as fast, and the fact that it is a bigger bullet means that it has a worse ballistic coefficient. In this particular case, it's not always the case, but in this particular case it does mean that. Worse ballistic coefficient, and it also moves a little bit more slowly, so it's really hard to use it at distance. For a lot of people, especially if you're going after like a deer-sized animal, 300 yards is probably about the maximum that you would ever want to push it, and realistically, probably within 200. Now, granted, most people that I know that go hunting, they usually take deer within 200 yards or less, so that's not a big deal. But if you're going after something else, like say pronghorn, some other kind of antelope, something that typically is out there a little bit further, 7.62 by 39 is not going to get you there. Well, technically you can get there, especially if you practice real well, have a good ammo, have a good gun that works with it, etc., but it's not very easy. Now, you're not going to probably want to take some of those shots with the 5.56 either. The 5.56 could probably get out there a lot better, but it is a very small bullet, and it's questionable as to how much damage it's going to be able to do once it gets out there. Is that really going to be a effective and humane way of harvesting your meat at that point? So neither one is really great for taking fairly large game at distance, but the 5.56 gun can go further practically, but you're going to be limited to the varmint size animals. 7.62 by 39, if you can connect, it would be a little bit better for a little bit larger animals, but it's a lot harder to connect at distance with it. But it is a very cheap round, so you can afford to go out and practice with it quite a bit more, and some people get really good with their AKs. There is a fellow online who runs the channel called the AK Operators Union. His name is Rob Ski, and he is a National Guardsman, and he is an excellent shot with his AKs. He has been able to make 600-yard shots on silhouette-sized, human silhouette-sized targets with basically fairly ordinary steel case 7.62 by 39 ammunition with relatively stock AKs. He usually does put a scope on them, of course. He doesn't usually do that open sight, but he can get out there to 600 yards, like I said, on a human-sized silhouette. So it can be done, but that takes a lot of skill, a lot of time, a lot of practice. All right, so those are the basic differences and some of the cost considerations. AKs are usually more expensive to start off with. ARs are generally less expensive. ARs are usually a lot easier to keep in working order because it's a lot easier to get parts for them and a lot easier to swap out parts. But you can wear out parts on an AR fairly quickly. AKs, on the other hand, especially if you get ones with a chrome line barrel, they tend to last a lot longer. Like I said, 20,000 to 40,000 rounds before you even have to think about changing out the barrel. They last a long time, but getting spare parts for them can be a major pain, especially if it's one of the kind of the big parts. Getting a new receiver would be very problematic a lot of times, but even the trunnion can be very problematic. Sometimes barrels can be an issue, sometimes not. A lot harder to get spare parts for them. AKs are more expensive to start off with, but they do shoot a lot cheaper ammunition, and that ammunition is better for larger game. Like I said, it's not great at distance, but it is better for larger game close up. 5.56 can be used for larger game, but you really wouldn't want to push it much past the size of a deer. You can use it at further distances if you're talking about varmints like coyotes and things like that, but its utility as a large game cartridge wanes very quickly with distance. Yes, you can make 400-yard plus shots with it with a lot of decent ARs pretty easily, but that doesn't mean you're going to want to take large game with it at 400 yards. That would usually not be all that successful. You either want to be a really good shot. Well, you would want to be a really good shot. But yeah, those are the basic differences, and also what you can expect in terms of cost. Like I said, ARs, plan on somewhere between 700 and 1,000, depending on if you get it new or used, those kinds of things. AKs, on the other hand, you might be able to get into a used one for $700, but it's probably a lot more likely that you're going to get into one for somewhere between $1,000 and $1,500. In terms of hunting application, you are probably better off with a typical hunting gun. That's what they're designed for. Hunting guns are designed to be fairly accurate, they're designed to be fairly powerful, they're designed to be fairly easy to carry. These kinds of guns that I have here, ARs and AKs, they are not designed for that, and because of that, that's just not their best application. Not that I wouldn't use them for that if I was into hunting. I probably would, just because I like ARs and AKs. But that's not really what they're designed for. And remember, they are intermediate cartridges that they fire. 5.56 and 7.62 by 39 are not overly powerful. Like I said, even out of a full-length gun, 5.56 is around 1,400-ish foot-pounds of kinetic energy. 7.62 by 39 is more, around 1,600-ish foot-pounds of kinetic energy, but that's really not a lot. You compare that to most of the more serious hunting cartridges that are out there, and most of those are well over 2,000 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, and some of them are well over 3,000 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, depending on the particular load you're talking about. Most of the true rifle calibers are considerably more powerful, and therefore that much more effective, especially at taking larger game. Pros and cons. Now, a lot of those hunting rifles also do not come with 30-round magazines. That is a fair point as well. As far as just the recreational fun of going out there and spraying a bunch of lead for the fun of going out and spraying a bunch of lead, yeah, hunting rifles are not so fun for that. And the fact that these are semi-autos, at least in their normal civilian configuration, so that you don't have to load around each time, does make it more convenient. And that's part of what you're paying for. The added expense of these guns is in the fact that they are self-loading, that you don't have to cycle the action every single time. There's part of it that is that. There's part of it that you're paying for the ability to have greater capacity, things like that. There's a reason why they're more expensive, but depending on the application, that you might not need that. Alright, so I think I've beat that horse to death, unfortunately. Poor horse. Thank you all very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. And for those of you who are not, I honestly do pray that you would come to know Christ, the only real Christ of history, the one of the Bible. I pray that you would know Him. I pray that you would submit to Him. I pray that you would repent before Him, because He is the only genuine Savior of humanity. And I want you to know that salvation. Amen.